I was driving back from the notary's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and I remember thinking the drive home along Highway 7 had never looked so beautiful. The maples were at their peak, that deep burning orange that only happens for about a week in Ontario, before everything goes brown and bare. I had the heat on low, CBC radio playing something classical I didn't recognize, and a folder of signed documents sitting on the passenger seat beside me. My older brother Edmund had died 6 weeks earlier. A stroke, quick, at his kitchen table in Kelowna. We hadn't been close in years, not since he moved west and I stayed in Peterborough, not since the silence between us grew wide enough to stop being uncomfortable and just become normal. But his lawyer had tracked me down, and the will was unambiguous. Edmund had left me his house in Kelowna, a vacation property on Okanagan Lake, and a registered investment account with a current value of just over $800,000. I kept thinking about how to tell my son and daughter-in-law. They'd been living with me for almost a year. I was going to make us all dinner, maybe open a bottle of wine, tell them that things were going to be different now. I pulled onto my street, saw the lights on in the living room, and felt the first real warmth I'd had in months. Then I heard them through the screen door, and everything I thought I knew about my family stopped being true. I need to go back a little because context matters here. My name is Russell Cook. I'm 68 years old. I spent 32 years with the Ontario Provincial Police, the last 12 as a senior investigator in financial crimes. I retired 4 years ago and moved into a smaller house on the east side of Peterborough. 3 bedrooms, a good yard, more space than I needed for one person. My wife Helen passed in 2019. Cancer, the kind that moves fast and doesn't give you time to say everything you mean to say. After she was gone, the house felt less like a home and more like a building I lived inside of. My son moved back in February. He's 37. His wife came with him. They told me it was a rough patch. Some bad decisions, a business venture that hadn't worked out, debts they were working through. I didn't ask for details. He's my son. You don't turn your son away when he needs somewhere to land. I cleaned out the spare room, put clean sheets on the bed, and told them to take whatever time they needed. I'd started to wonder, by October, whether I'd made a mistake. Not about having them there. I never regretted that. But something had shifted in the house. There were conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms. My son had started asking questions about my finances that felt careful in a way I didn't like. What did my pension amount to, month to month? Whether I'd looked into long-term care insurance, whether I'd ever thought about what would happen to the house if my health declined. I told myself he was being practical. Told myself that's what adults do when they're concerned about a parent. I almost believed it. The day Edmund's lawyer called, I was alone in my office. I took notes on the yellow legal pad out of pure habit, property address in Kelowna, account numbers, estimated valuation. I wrote down the figure, $812,000 in registered investments, plus the 2 properties, and then I sat with the pen in my hand for a long time, not writing anything. I'd been carrying those notes in my jacket pocket all day. I'd gone to the notary to begin the estate transfer. I'd signed what needed signing, and now I was driving home to tell my family that things were going to be all right. I parked on the street. Old cop habit. I don't like being blocked in. The front walk needed raking, the leaves piling up against the steps, and I made a note to do it on the weekend. The screen door was latched, but the inner door stood open, and their voices carried clearly through the mesh. My daughter-in-law's voice first. Higher. Urgent. He can't find out how much it actually is until we're ready. If he changes the will before we can do anything, we're finished. I stopped walking. My hand was 2 inches from the door handle. He won't. My son's voice, flat in a way I'd never heard before. He trusts me. That's the whole point. But the timing, he was at the notary today. That means the transfer's already starting. We have to move faster than we planned. We stick to what we decided. Dr. Okafor. He'll see Dad next week, do the assessment, write what we need. We've been building the case for months. The confusion about his medications, the thing with the car last spring. I stood completely still on my own front walk. The leaves were blowing around my shoes. The thing with the car. I'd scraped the bumper, backing out of a Canadian Tire parking lot in April. I'd mentioned it to my son over coffee, laughed about it, he'd filed it away. And if he refuses to go, my son didn't hesitate. He won't refuse if you ask him. He still thinks you're on his side. Use that. Make it about his heart. Tell him you're worried. A long pause. Then my daughter-in-law, quieter, and after the assessment, we file for substitute decision-making authority. I've already talked to a paralegal. Once we have the paperwork, we control his accounts. The inheritance gets rolled into the estate under our management. We pay off what we owe, sell one of the BC properties, and he's comfortable somewhere. That's not nothing. Somewhere. There are good facilities. He'd be taken care of. Somewhere. A good facilities. He'd be taken care of. I had 32 years in law enforcement. I'd listened to 100 conversations I wasn't meant to hear, and I had never once felt the ground shift under me the way it did on that front walk. My son was describing a plan to have me declared mentally incapable, seize legal authority over my finances, and liquidate my brother's estate. And he was talking about it in my house, in the living room I'd painted myself 3 summers ago, using the same measured voice he used when he was explaining something to someone he considered less intelligent than himself. I did not open the door. I walked back to my car, sat down, and shut the door very quietly. For about 10 minutes I didn't do anything, just looked at the dashboard. The classical music was still playing on the radio, and I turned it off because I needed quiet. There was a part of me, the father part, the part that had rocked that boy to sleep, that had driven him to hockey practice at 5 in the morning for 11 winters straight, that had stood at his mother's grave with his arm across my shoulders. That part wanted to go back inside and say, "What did you just say to me?" Wanted to see his face when he realized I'd heard every word. I didn't. That's not how you win. I'd spent more than 3 decades watching people destroy cases through impatience, suspects tipped off too early, evidence gathered sloppily, confrontations that felt satisfying in the moment and collapsed in court 6 months later. I knew exactly what this was: elder financial abuse, substitute decision-making fraud, conspiracy, and I knew that if I was going to do anything about it, I needed to do it right. I pulled out my phone and called the one person I trusted completely, Lawrence Beaumont. Larry and I had come up together in the OPP, partnered for 8 years before he moved to the Ontario Securities Commission. He'd retired 2 years before me. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Russ, what's wrong?" Not a question. He knew my voice well enough. I told him. Sitting in the car, 2 houses down from my own front door, I told him everything I'd heard. Larry listened without interrupting, another skill you either develop in this work or you don't. When I finished, he let out a slow breath. "You need to document this. Everything, starting tonight. You also need a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. Someone who handles capacity disputes and elder law specifically. I know someone in Toronto, Judith Brennan. She's done cases like this for 20 years, and she doesn't lose." "What about the assessment they're planning?" "Let them arrange it. Don't resist. Don't tip them off. We want them to take the action, not just plan it. There's a significant difference legally." I know you know, Russ. I'm just saying it out loud so we're both thinking clearly." A pause. "This is your son. I heard what he said. I know. I'm sorry." Another pause. "Go back inside. Act normal. Can you do that?" I had interviewed suspects for 3 decades. I had sat across tables from people who'd done terrible things and given nothing away. I could act normal for 1 evening. "Yes," I said. "I'll call Judith tonight." We'll have a plan before tomorrow morning. I put the phone in my pocket, sat for another minute, then got out of the car and walked back up to the house. This time I came in through the front door with my keys, louder, giving them time to adjust their faces. My daughter-in-law was in the kitchen. My son was on the couch with his laptop. They both looked up. "You were gone a long time," my son said. "Everything okay with the notary?" "Fine, just paperwork. I set my jacket on the hook. Edmund's estate. Going to take a few months to sort out fully." My son's expression stayed very neutral. "Big estate? Not really. Some property. The house in Kelowna, maybe. We'll see what everything is worth once probate clears." I kept my voice easy, slightly tired. "I'm going to get cleaned up before dinner. What are we having?" My daughter-in-law smiled at me from the kitchen doorway. "I made a roast. Your favorite. That's thoughtful." "Thank you." I went upstairs, closed my bedroom door, and sat on the edge of the bed with my hands folded. There was a full-length mirror on the back of the closet door, and I could see myself in it. Old man, winter coming in his face, sitting very still. I looked like someone who didn't know anything yet. That was the performance I needed to maintain. That night, my daughter-in-law brought me a cup of chamomile tea before bed. She did this occasionally, and I'd never thought anything of it. This time I watched her hands as she set the cup on my nightstand. She was smiling, touching my shoulder, asking whether I'd slept well the night before. I thanked her and waited until I heard her footsteps at the bottom of the stairs. The tea was slightly cloudier than it should have been. Very slightly. Not enough that I'd have noticed if I hadn't been looking for it. I poured it into the clean water bottle I kept on my nightstand, sealed it, and replaced it with tap water. Then I lay back on my bed, still dressed, and stared at the ceiling. Larry texted at 11. Judith Brennan was available for a call at 7 the next morning. He had also, in the hours since I'd called him, spoken to a contact at the Ontario Provincial Police's Financial Crimes Unit, someone we'd both worked with, a detective inspector named Colette Marsh, and she had agreed to review whatever materials we could gather. I typed back, "There may be a physical sample. I'll bring it." His reply came quickly. "Good man. I didn't sleep much. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle the way old houses do. And I thought about my son at 7 years old, standing on a dock at a rented cottage north of Bancroft, too nervous to jump into the lake. I'd stood beside him for 20 minutes, neither of us saying much, until he jumped. That was the kind of father I'd tried to be, patient, present, not pushing." I thought about whether any of it had mattered, and then I made myself stop thinking about it, because that kind of thinking is a trap when you need to be functional. At 6:30 I was dressed and downstairs. I made coffee, fed the neighbor's cat who had long ago adopted my back porch, and read the morning news on my tablet. When my daughter-in-law came downstairs at 8, I was on my second cup. "You're up early," she said. "Always am." I smiled at her. "How did you sleep?" "Well." "Really well." She looked at me carefully. "You feeling okay, Russell? You seemed a little off last night. Tired." "Getting old," I said, and watched her relax slightly. My son came down at 8:30. He mentioned, casually, over toast, that my daughter-in-law had made an appointment for me with a physician. A general wellness check, he called it. Next Wednesday. Someone new, not my regular doctor. He said they were just being proactive, that they worried about me now that winter was coming, that I'd been showing some signs of fatigue and forgetfulness. He listed examples. The car in the spring. A bill I'd apparently paid twice. Forgetting a dinner invitation from a neighbor. I'd paid the bill twice because I'd switched banks and the automatic payment hadn't canceled properly. I'd forgotten the dinner invitation because I hadn't wanted to go. Neither of these things had registered to me as anything other than ordinary life. Now I understood they'd been cataloging. "That's thoughtful," I said. "What time?" 10 in the morning. I'll drive you. Perfect. I folded my hands around my mug. I appreciate you both looking out for me. The call with Judith Brennan was from my car, parked in the Canadian Tire lot where I'd scraped my bumper. A piece of irony I didn't appreciate much in the moment. Judith was direct, unhurried, and clearly very smart. She told me what we were dealing with in plain language. What they're attempting is abuse of the substitute decision-maker process under the Substitute Decision-Maker Process under the Substitute Decisions Act. If they obtain fraudulent capacity documentation and file for guardianship of property, they gain legal control over your assets. Given what you've described, the property values, the investment account, we're looking at a significant case. The physical sample you mentioned, if it tests positive for a sedating substance, adds criminal code charges. Administering a noxious substance, Section 245. Fraud over $5,000, Section 380. Conspiracy under 465. What do I need? Recordings of them discussing the plan. Documentation of the medical appointment and any financial steps they take. The physical sample analyzed. And your timeline, in writing, with dates and details while they're fresh. I can have all of that. A brief pause. Mr. Wright, Cook, how are you holding up? I looked at the Canadian Tire across the parking lot. I'm functioning. That's probably the right answer. Another pause. I want to be clear about what this process looks like emotionally. You will likely have to sit across from your son in a courtroom. It will be difficult regardless of how prepared you are professionally. I've sat across from difficult people before. I know, this is different. She was right that it was different. I didn't say so. Larry drove up from Oshawa that evening, late, after my son and daughter-in-law had gone to bed. I met him in the backyard with the water bottle, in an evidence bag I'd taken from the kit I still kept in the basement. Some habits are just permanent. He'd brought a small field test kit, the same kind we'd used on hundreds of cases. He tested a few drops from the bottle. The result came up positive for traces of a benzodiazepine compound, consistent with medication that would produce heavy sedation in someone my size, within 40 minutes, lasting several hours. Larry photographed the result, photographed the bottle with its seal, and wrote up a chain of custody note in his careful, cramped handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. Then he looked up at me. They actually did it, he said. Not shocked. He'd stopped being shocked by people a long time ago. Just stating the fact. They did, Russ. He set down the kit. I'm sorry. I know. I picked up the evidence bag. Let's make sure it counts. Over the next 4 days, I lived 2 lives simultaneously. In the house, I was a slightly tired, somewhat forgetful 68-year-old widower who was grateful for his son's concern and happy to see a doctor. I took my coffee in the morning, fumbled slightly with the TV remote in the evenings, mentioned my knees were bothering me, and asked my son twice about whether he'd noticed the water pressure in the upstairs bathroom was lower than usual, which it genuinely was, and had nothing to do with anything except that old houses have old pipes. In the car, in the Canadian Tire parking lot, in Judith's office in Toronto, I was building a case. Larry sourced 2 digital voice recorders from an old colleague, the kind you clip inside a breast pocket, motion-activated, capable of picking up a conversation across a large room. One in my jacket, one in the small silk plant on the living room bookshelf, positioned to capture the couch and coffee table. Ontario law allows for single-party consent recording, meaning I was the only person who needed to know. On the Thursday before the Wednesday appointment, I came downstairs earlier than usual and found my son on the phone. He didn't hear me on the stairs. I stood in the hallway. Dr. Okafor, yes. Confirmed for Wednesday, 10 a.m.? He doesn't suspect anything. Very cooperative. Yes, I understand the scope of the evaluation. Cognitive decline indicators, difficulty with financial decision-making, safety concerns related to living alone. We'll have the documentation we discussed ready for your review beforehand. A pause. Yes. The amount we discussed is fine. E-transfer is fine. Another pause. He won't be a problem. I walked back upstairs quietly, sat at my desk, and wrote down what I'd heard with a timestamp. Then I forwarded the recorder's audio file from my jacket. I'd activated it when I got up, out of habit, to Judith and to Detective Inspector Marsh. Colette Marsh called me 40 minutes later. That's more than enough for a production order on this Dr. Okafor. I've already found 2 prior complaints filed with the College of Physicians and Surgeons. He's been investigated before, never charged. We'll let the appointment proceed and intercept at the point of financial transaction. How close will your team be? Close enough that you will not be in that office for more than 60 seconds after the money changes hands. I give you my word on that. On the Sunday evening before the appointment, my son poured me a scotch after dinner, something I'd rarely seen him do, small gestures of warmth that I now read as stage management, and sat with me in the living room. He told me he was glad we'd had this time together, that he knew the past year had been hard, that he wanted things to be stable for me going forward, and that he and his wife had been thinking about my long-term well-being a great deal. I told him I appreciated it, that having family nearby meant more than he knew. I meant part of that, the way you can mean something and have it be true and terrible at the same time. He said, "We'll get you sorted out, Dad." I nodded and looked at the television and thought, yes, I suppose we will. The drive to the appointment was 40 minutes. My son drove, my daughter-in-law in the passenger seat. They were warm and attentive, pointing out road conditions, asking whether the seat heater was comfortable, whether I was nervous about the doctor. I said I was fine, a little tired. The neighborhood where the clinic was located got progressively less familiar. Industrial streets off a service road in the east end of the city. Not a district where you'd expect a medical office. I registered that and said nothing. Colette Marsh's team had been on us since we pulled out of my driveway. I didn't look for them. You never look for them. Dr. Okafor's office occupied a second-floor unit above a flooring supply company. The waiting room held 3 chairs and a rack of old Maclean's magazines, and we were the only ones there. Okafor came out immediately, a compact man in his 50s wearing a lab coat over a dress shirt. He shook my hand and my son's hand, guided me to an examination room that smelled like printer toner and something else, something I couldn't identify but didn't like. My son and daughter-in-law followed us in. The examination was 13 minutes long. He asked me my birth date, the current Prime Minister's name, what year I'd retired, to count backward from 100 by 7s. I gave one wrong answer deliberately, stopped at 65 when I should have gone to 58, looked at my son with mild uncertainty. My son looked satisfied. Okafor set down his clipboard and turned to my son with a practiced expression. "Your concerns are well-founded. I'm observing evidence of moderate cognitive decline consistent with early-stage impairment that would affect the capacity for complex financial management and independent living decisions. I'll prepare the formal documentation." My son leaned forward. "We appreciate your thoroughness. We want to make sure he's protected." "Of course." Okafor opened a desk drawer. "As discussed, I'll require my consulting fee at this stage." My son reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. I recognized it as the one that had been in his laptop bag all week. Okafor took the envelope, opened it briefly, nodded. The door opened. Colette Marsh was first, badge out, 2 officers behind her, a third appearing at the window. She was exactly as I remembered her from the OPP, tall, unhurried, a certain quality of attention that meant she saw everything in a room simultaneously. "Dr. Tatter, Victor Okafor. I'm Detective Inspector Marsh, Ontario Provincial Police. You're under arrest for fraud over $5,000, conspiracy, and professional misconduct. You have the right to retain and instruct counsel without delay." Okafor set the envelope down on his desk very carefully, as though he might still need it later. My son stood up. What is this? There's been a mistake. This is a legitimate medical. Turn around, please. The officer behind Marsh was very calm about it. My daughter-in-law looked at me. Her face was doing something complicated and hard to watch, cycling through confusion and fear, and then, underneath those, something I can only describe as calculation, still working the problem even now. I stood up from the examination chair. When I spoke, I used the voice I'd used in 200 interviews, level, factual, without heat. "I heard you," I said to my son. "3 weeks ago, through the screen door. All of it. The assessment, the guardianship filing, the plan to liquidate Edmund's estate. I heard your wife ask where I'd be kept, and I heard you say there are good facilities." He stared at me. Something passed through his face that I won't try to describe. "The tea was tested," I said. "It came back positive for a benzodiazepine compound that's administering a noxious substance under Section 245 of the Criminal Code." The phone call with Okafor was recorded. The conversation in my living room on multiple evenings was recorded. Single-party consent in Ontario. Legal. And fully admissible. I looked at him steadily. "I spent 32 years building cases exactly like this one. My son's lawyer arrived at the station 4 hours later. Judith Brennan was already there when I finished my statement. She filed the emergency asset protection order while I was still signing my witness declaration. Accounts frozen, property transfers blocked, Edmund's estate secured entirely. The total value they'd been working toward was just under $1.4 million. Colette Marsh walked me out to the parking lot around 4 in the afternoon. The sun was low in the gray Ontario sky, that particular flat light you get in late October when the clouds come down. She shook my hand and held it a moment. "You did everything right," she said. "I did what I knew how to do. That's usually the same thing." She let go of my hand. "The charges will take time. These cases always do, but the evidence is clean, Mr. Cook. Very clean." Larry picked me up. He didn't say much on the drive back to Peterborough. Just put on the CBC and let the silence be what it was. I watched the highway, the exit signs, the familiar geography of a life I'd built over 6 decades and nearly lost in a single week. I went back to the house alone. They'd taken some clothes, a few things, when they'd been permitted to collect personal belongings after processing. The rooms they'd used had that hollow quality that spaces get when people leave in a hurry. A drawer left open, a coffee ring on the nightstand, the particular absence of someone who'd been present long enough to mark the air. I closed the drawer. I left the coffee ring. It seemed too deliberate to clean it just then. I made a pot of tea, real tea, my own, no ambiguity, and sat at the kitchen table. I called Edmund's lawyer the next morning and told her to proceed with the full estate transfer. I named Larry as my estate trustee. Judith set up proper structures so that the Kelowna property and the investment accounts were protected long-term, held in trust with proper oversight, the kind of arrangement I should have set up years ago and hadn't fought to because nothing had ever made me think I needed to. The trial was set for the following autumn. I'm not going to say it was clean or easy, because it wasn't. I sat in a courtroom in Peterborough and watched a Crown attorney play back a recording of my son's voice saying he won't be a problem, and watched my son's face while he heard it, and neither of those things felt like victory. Okafor lost his license and received a 22-month sentence. My son and daughter-in-law each received conditional sentences and 3 years probation, the judge citing the scale of the planned fraud and the particular cruelty of the method. A family member, dependency, a deliberate chemistry introduced into the food of a man who trusted the hands that prepared it. I had a lawyer send my son a letter the week after sentencing. Not a personal letter, a legal document, formal and precise, outlining the terms under which I was prepared to have any future contact, which were strict and clearly defined. I don't know whether he read it carefully. I don't know whether it reached him the way I meant it. There are limits to what you can make another person understand, even with the right words in the right order. I still live in the same house on the east side of Peterborough. The furnace got replaced last winter with part of Edmund's estate. The gutters are new. I hired a service to come once a week and do the things that had started to pile up, not because I couldn't do them, but because I finally had enough to stop using that logic as a reason to be exhausted all the time. The neighbor's cat is still adopting my back porch. Edmund left me a note at the end of his will. His lawyer mentioned it, read it to me in her office in Kelowna on the day I flew out to see the properties for the first time. It said simply, "For the brother who kept his head. I always knew you would." I don't know how he knew. We hadn't been close in years. But he knew me when we were boys, and some things hold even through a long silence. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about what holds and what doesn't, and whether the difference has more to do with the thing itself or the people doing the holding. I don't have a clean answer. I don't think one exists. But I have a house that's mine, and a case that closed the way it was supposed to, and on clear mornings when the light is right, the drive along Highway 7 is still one of the most beautiful things I know. What I keep coming back to, even now, isn't the courtroom or the recordings or the moment Colette Marsh walked through that door. It's the front walk, the leaves blowing around my shoes, the 2 inches between my hand and the door handle. That pause, that small instinctive hesitation, was the thing that changed everything. I didn't plan it. It wasn't strategy. It was just a retired cop's body knowing, before his mind caught up, that something in the air was wrong. I've thought a lot about what made it possible to do what I did next, instead of going inside and confronting my son on the spot. And I think it comes down to something I learned slowly, over 32 years in law enforcement. Something that nobody teaches you directly, but that you absorb through every case that fell apart because someone acted too fast. The work demands a particular kind of honesty with yourself, about what you actually know versus what you feel, about what the evidence shows versus what you want to be true. I had to be honest enough to admit that my son had said what I'd heard him say, and that loving him didn't change that fact. That kind of honesty is hard. It might be the hardest thing I've ever had to practice. But without it, I would have walked in that door and said something, and they would have denied it. And I would have had nothing but my word against theirs, and a lot of grief and no resolution. The second thing is something closer to clear-headedness under pressure. The ability to keep thinking when everything in you wants to stop. When I sat in that car 2 houses down from my own home, I wasn't calm. I want to be clear about that. I was not calm. But I had learned over a long career that the moment when you most want to react is often the moment when you most need to wait. Larry understood that. Judith understood that. Colette understood that. Colette understood that. The people who helped me were people who'd spent their lives developing that same discipline, and when I called on it myself, it held. It held because I'd built it over time, through work that required it of me every day. You don't find that kind of steadiness when you need it, if you haven't been practicing it when you don't. And then there's the question of what you owe the truth. Not in an abstract sense, but in the practical sense of being willing to see a thing through, even when it costs you something you can't replace. I knew, going into that doctor's office in the East End, that what came after would not be simple. I knew there would be a trial. I knew I would sit in a room and watch my son hear his own voice played back to him. I knew I would lose something permanent, something that had been broken long before I heard it through the screen door. But that would be finally, formally, irretrievably gone once the law was done with it. I went anyway, not because it felt right in the way that comfort feels right, but because the alternative, letting it stand, pretending I hadn't heard, trading the truth for a quiet house, would have required me to become someone I didn't recognize. Russell Cook is still a man I recognize. That matters to me. Some mornings, when the light is good and the neighbor's cat is on the porch and the new furnace is running quietly. That's enough.